Hey, Merry Christmas. Welcome to Westbridge Church. And truly, those of us from Minnesota really understand that quite a bit, don't we? Truly a Minnesota goodbye. We stand at the door for hours. We ask a bunch of questions, and that's typically how it goes for us. So glad you're here with us today. Welcome all of you joining us online. Those of you in our cafe, if you're in a parent viewing room, thanks for joining us. This is one of 7 services where we gather to celebrate and remember and think about the hope that we have in Jesus. And yet, that's why so many people gather this time of year. But I recognize it's not why all of us have gathered here. Some of you are here because you have to be here. That's okay. Like, you didn't really want to be here, but it's tradition, so you showed up. Every year, I love this, every year at Christmas, somebody, somewhere along the way across one of our services will just be like, hey, man, that was great. See you at Easter. And I'm like, dude, thanks for keeping it real. I appreciate it. And some of you are here because, your parents pressured you and it just wasn't worth the fight. Some of you are here because grandma's guilt trip, and she was good at that. Some of you are here because of a girlfriend's ultimatum. Some of you are here because a friend invited you and you could see how much it meant to him, and you're like, why not? What's the worst that could happen, right? And no matter why you're here, I just want you to know, I'm glad that you're here. I'm really glad you're here. And I don't think it's an accident that you're here. And I just want you to know, whatever brought you here, I think God wants you to know that there is hope that can be found in Jesus. And I think all of us could use a little more hope in our lives. When Jesus came to earth, he knows what it's like to live on this planet, to deal with the suffering, to deal with the hardship, to deal with the sorrow and the struggles and the stuff of life that we experience. One of the eyewitnesses to the life and teachings of Jesus was a guy named John. It was one of his closest friends, and he would write about the life of Jesus. And when he was describing what it was like to experience Jesus, this is what he wrote. He said that Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. Think about that. Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. I love the way that the Message paraphrase says it. It says that Jesus put on skin and moved into our neighborhood. What a great way to think about that. He experienced what life is like. And because he experienced what life is like, we can go to him when we need to find hope. There's another document that's found in the New Testament. It's what we call the New Testament. It's the last third of the Bible. It was written in the first century, and this particular document was written to a group of people who were Hebrew people following Jesus. And the author says this, that in this writing, the author says that we can go to God with a confident hope that he will help us when we need it most. We can go to him with a confident hope. Like, if some of you need some help right now and you're just not sure that God sees, you're not sure that God knows, you're not sure that God cares, you're not sure that God understands, that's really the message of the Christmas story, is that you can have a hope that God really does see and that God does care, that God does know what you're going through, and that God does understand because he was like us. I was reading recently about a medical professor in Germany who recognized the need for more doctors to go into geriatric medicine, which is caring for the elderly. And she said it's very, very difficult to try and convince these 20-something young, energetic, healthy doctors to go into this field, even though the need is great and the demographic is growing. How do you convince somebody who can't understand what it's like to get older? And it's difficult because they don't know what it's like. They don't understand the challenges of growing older. And so she tried to do a bunch of lectures and seminars and presentations to try to convince these young doctors to go into this field, and none of it worked. And so eventually she developed what she called the age man suit. And this would be a suit that she would have medical students wear to help them understand what it's like to get older. And so it came with these earpieces that they would put in their ears, and it would sort of make their sound diminish, but certain sounds would get really loud, and then it would diminish their sound and their hearing. It came with these tinted goggles that would diminish their eyesight, make the color a little bit off, and throw off their depth perception, and they'd have to squint to see certain things. It came with these braces on their elbows and their knees, and it just made their joints just a little more stiff and the movements a little more difficult. It came with a weighted Kevlar vest that went on their chest and kind of just sat there and just putting pressure on their chest, making it a little more difficult to breathe. She had it so that it would press on your bladder and you'd have to go to the bathroom 4 or 5 times a night. No, that's not true, but you can imagine that would have really made it cross the finish line, right? I started to think, like, what else could she have done to really enhance this suit, you know? And I thought, like, what if she could have made the suit so that it just sort of gave you this inexplicable desire to eat dinner at 4:30 in the afternoon at Golden Corral, you know? And you'd go home and watch Wheel of Fortune and old episodes of Law and Order. You'd sleep in till 6 a.m. Like, what if she could make it so that you'd lose hair on your head, but whatever hair you were losing on your head, it would just inexplicably grow in other places that you didn't know it could? Like, that would have really moved the needle, right? But the whole point is to stop and imagine what it must be like. And she expressed that her hope was that as her students, as they felt what it was like to grow older, that they would have empathy, that they would care more, and that they would have a deep desire to want to help people in that stage of life. And I think that is part of the hope of the Christmas story. That Jesus experienced what it was like, and that because of that, we have hope that he cares, that he wants to help. And that's really good news for us, because all of us could use a little more hope. In his book, Keeping Hope Alive, Lewis Smedes, who is an author and theologian, he writes this. He says, "Hope is to our spirits what oxygen is to our lungs. Lose hope and you die. They may not bury you for a while, but without hope, you're dead inside. The only way to face the future is to fly straight into it on the wings of hope. Hope is the energy of the soul." And for some of you, maybe during this time of year, you've just found that your souls are tired. Your souls are weary. You're just kind of sick of it all. So where do you find a hope? It's no accident that in the famous poem, Dante's Inferno, when Dante is trying to help us understand what hell is like, he puts a sign out in front of the entrance to hell, and the sign reads, "Leave behind all hope, those who enter here." Like, in his mind, when trying to describe what hell is, that's how hell is understood. It's just the complete absence of hope. Maybe you identify with that. And maybe it's just kind of like your life feels like there's an absence of hope. And it's not because you haven't tried, it's actually because you have tried. You've tried to put your hope in a lot of different things, and it's just let you down again and again and again, and you end up disappointed. You put your hope in family, and it feels like they let you down. You put your hope in a relationship, and you gave your heart to someone, and it feels like your heart got broken. You put your hope in your career, or you put your hope in your finances, or you put your hope in the government, or you put your hope in a political party or platform, or you think, man, I'm just going to put my hope in my children, or I'm going to put my hope in sports, or I'm going to put my hope in my children's sports. That's a great one. That's worked so well for so many parents. And the truth is that it just seems like every time you put your hope in something, it lets you down. And as a result, it's easy for us to give up on hope. It's easy for us to do that. Like, you start to live life with just kind of this whatever attitude. It's like, I'm just going to resign myself to the fact that there's no hope. So you just kind of scroll your way through the holidays, right? Self-medicate. You know, Daddy needs a Santa shot. And just kind of make it through. And you just begin to accept, okay, life is just disappointment. There's no hope. It's just going to be an inevitable part of life to just live disappointed. And so here's the question. Is there a real hope that won't let us down? Is there a real hope? On this Christmas Eve, is there another hope that won't let you down? Is there another hope on which you can stand firm? Is there a hope on which you can put your weight, on which you can build your future? Because I just think there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of discouragement, and a lot of depression, and a lot of it is very symptomatic of our lack of a real hope. About 700 years before Jesus is born, there's a prophet named Isaiah, and he writes about the birth of Jesus. And the way he describes it is that hope is being born into the world. It's just amazing writing. And the things that Isaiah writes are prophecies, which means he's saying these are things that are going to come at some point in the future. Little does he know that it will be 700 years before these things come to pass. And these prophecies are uniquely fulfilled in the person of Jesus. When he's going to be born, how he's going to come to this earth, how he's going to die. And as he's writing this, he's kind of setting this up. And in chapter 9, these are the words that Isaiah would use to describe what this would be like. He says this, that in a land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. In a land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And so there is this hope that is born as we celebrate Christmas. And it's interesting, though, as you read Isaiah and as you read his prophecies, I think Isaiah himself knows it's hard to believe. He's like, this, who's going to believe this, right? His whole message is a message of hope. It doesn't take place for another 700 years. And Isaiah is saying this, hey, help is on the way. And not only is it difficult to believe, but it's also difficult to imagine the way in which God is coming to earth. And I think even Isaiah recognizes that. He writes in Isaiah 53, verse 1, he says, who has believed our message? To whom has the Lord revealed his powerful arm? Like, who's even going to believe this? I love the way, again, that the Message paraphrase says it. It says this, who believes what we have heard and seen? Who would have thought God's saving power would look like this? He's like, nobody's gonna imagine the way that God would come into the world. This just isn't the way that any of us would do this. It's such a strange way to save the world. Bethlehem is a small, rural town with no political status whatsoever, just a little redneck village. You would think he should have at least been born in Jerusalem. It's the biggest city of the time. It's got the temple there. It's got political power. And Mary and Joseph are poor peasants who lived in obscurity. You would think at least Jesus should be born to a noble family who's got some kind of military might or some kind of political status. And he spends his first night in a feeding trough, surrounded by the smells of a barn. You would think he should have at least been born in a palace or some kind of stately manor. And the first people to hear the news are shepherds. And shepherds don't look anything like what they do in our Pottery Barn nativity sets, right? It's like a little GQ model with a robe on, you know? And they were dirty and stinky and looked down upon because it wasn't a job that anybody wanted. They stayed outside the city limits with the sheep, and they're often considered unclean by the rest of society. They had such little respect during that time, they wouldn't have even been allowed to be a witness in court. And this is who this good news is announced to. It's just not the way we would have done it. So why would God do it like this? It just doesn't really make any sense. And I think even Isaiah recognized that. He's like, who would believe this message? Nobody would have believed that God would have come like this. And I think that is exactly where hope is born. God doesn't need help. If he would have been born into a powerful city, people might have said this, well, yeah, right time, right place, and look at what fate can do for you. If he had been born into this wealthy family, people might have said, yeah, look what money can do for you. If he had been born the son of a king, people might have said, well, yeah, look at what political positioning can do for you. But he was born to a poor peasant couple in a nothing town, and the only real conclusion you're left with is, look at what God can do. And there's so much hope in this for us because God comes into the most impossible of circumstances. And he says, I can work with this. It's almost as if God stacks the deck against himself and then goes, now watch. Watch what I can do. And we have hope because of God's power demonstrated in that first Christmas story. And Jesus made himself nothing. You can tell the depth of one's love by the level of their sacrifice. And Jesus didn't go from heaven to a palace. He went from heaven to a feeding trough. And the depth of his love can be felt by the level of his sacrifice. And when the God of the universe loves you that way, what won't he do for you? And there's so much hope in that for us. And Isaiah would go on to write this. The next verse, he says, my servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, like a root in dry ground. He says he's fragile, he's vulnerable. In fact, he would say there is nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. And Jesus wasn't depending on all the things that we think are necessary to make a difference in the world. He comes into this world fragile and vulnerable, and he's exposed, and there's nothing about him that would have attracted us to him. I was looking at some Christmas items on Google this last week, and they all have this one thing in common. They're all supposed to have Jesus at the center of them. And I came across this coffee mug, and it says, he is the reason for the season, and it's got a picture of Jesus right in the center. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I kind of looked a little bit closer, and obviously it's just an artist rendering. There's no actual pictures of Jesus floating around anywhere. And I'm looking at this picture of Jesus, and as I'm looking at it, my soul is just confronted with this one simple but profound question. Is that Keanu Reeves? I think that's world famous actor, former sexiest man alive, Keanu Reeves. It's like the artist just started in his mind with what he imagined Jesus looked like, and then he's just like, he just ended up with Keanu Reeves with a red sash, and now he is the reason for so many people's season. And there's something about us that kind of likes the idea of that, right? It's like Jesus must have been this sort of winsome type of personality who lived a charmed life. And Isaiah says, no, listen, you've got the wrong picture of Jesus. There was nothing that would have attracted us to him. In fact, Isaiah says this, he was despised and rejected. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. Now think about that. For some of you, you're like, that's the Jesus I can relate to. I can relate to a Jesus who's a man of sorrows. I can relate to a Jesus who's acquainted with deepest grief. Some of you, that's your story. That's a season for you right now where you're acquainted with deepest grief. There's an empty chair around your table this season. And for whatever reason, and the people who know you best know that you're trying to deal with it. They aren't sure if they should say anything, but they see you dealing with it. They don't want to bring it up because they love you. But when you hear about a Jesus that is a man of sorrows, when you hear about a Jesus that is acquainted with deepest grief, you go, okay, now that's a Jesus I can relate to. And Jesus knows how you feel. He was acquainted with that type of grief and suffering. He wasn't born to a prince and a princess. He wasn't born in a palace with privilege. He's not a one-percenter. He endured suffering. He didn't exempt himself from it. And so he comes in this way for you and for me out of his love for us. And then here's how we respond. Isaiah says this, and we turned our backs on him and looked the other way. That he is acquainted with sorrow. He's acquainted with grief. He comes to us and we turn our backs on him. I read this story recently in NPR about a man named Frank who lives in San Diego, California with his wife. And him and his wife have a son, an adult son, who is a homeless heroin addict walking the streets of Denver. And Frank is out in his yard one day, and they've tried everything possible to rescue their son from his addiction. And one day he's out in the yard, and he's cutting the grass, and he's just sort of kind of going through his mind, like, what can we possibly do? Because if we don't do something, we've tried everything, there's got to be something we can do, because I don't know if my son has much time left. I think this addiction is going to take his life. And so he comes in from cutting the grass, and he just sort of has this idea, and he says to his wife, I'm going to fly to Denver, and I'm going to find our son, and I'm just going to be homeless with him. She goes, what? He goes, yeah, I don't know what else to do. And so he takes nothing with him. He calls a guy named Chris Connor, who is a homeless advocate in the Denver area. And he helps him sort of figure out the general area where his son might be living. And so Frank just buys a one-way ticket to Denver. He takes nothing with him, and he starts to wander the streets of Denver until one day he finds his son. And he expresses what that feeling is like. This is what Frank writes. He says, my son has no idea that I'm walking toward him, and I can see that he can't stand without the support of a building. I go up to him, and he sees me, and he can't believe that I'm there, and he turns his back on me. I don't even care. I just grab him and squeeze him as hard as I can. And for the next week, Frank just is a homeless guy with his son. He stays with his son, foraging through the garbage for food, sleeping in the park, slapping away the rats. He doesn't shower or shave. His clothes get dirty and stinky and smelly and stained. And Chris Connor, the advocate, talked about how he had helped a lot of parents locate their kids. But he said, I've never had a parent who went this far to actually descend into homelessness. And when asked about it, why would you do this? This was Frank's response. He says this, the only thing I could think to do is just go there and show him how much I love him by just being there. And God became flesh and dwelt among us. This is exactly what God does for you and me. He came and made himself like one of us because it was the only way. And because there's no length he won't go to in order to rescue us from the things that have us imprisoned, because he wants you to know he understands what it's like. The things that you go through, the things that I go through. And when I think about all the things I've put my hope in that have disappointed me, I've put my hope in all these different things. And if I'm being honest, the primary source of my disappointment is me. Like, there are plenty of times I've been disappointed by people and circumstances, and they've let me down, but nobody has disappointed me more than me. If I'm being honest, I would have thought at this point in my life I'd be a lot less selfish and a lot more patient. Right? My age, surely, lust and pride would be mastered. I mean, I'm a pastor. I'm a professional Christian. Right? But listen, don't put your hope in me. You're going to be disappointed. And my guess is, maybe I'm not the only one, perhaps when you think about the things that you've put your hope in that have let you down, if you're honest with yourself, you go, nobody's disappointed you more than you. Because you've set some standards that I want to do this, and I want to be this kind of person, I want to be this kind of friend, I want to be this kind of spouse, I want to be this kind of employee, and you fall short of your own standards. And listen to how Isaiah continues in these verses. He says this, "Yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down." He was a man he was acquainted with sorrows, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. But it wasn't his sorrows, and it wasn't his grief, and it wasn't his struggle. He was carrying ours. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We've left God's paths to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. When you understand that means there is hope found in him. There's hope found in him, that he is carrying our struggles. He's carrying our sins. He's carrying our shortcomings. He's carrying our discouragement. He's carrying our pain. He's carrying our grief. That God took all of that and put it on him, and now we can find hope in him because he has carried that for us. Frederick Buehner is an author. He has a book called The Hungering Dark. He puts this so poetically. I love the way he writes this. "The face in the sky, the child born in the night among beasts, and nothing is ever the same again. Once they have seen him in a stable, they can never be sure where he will appear, or to what lengths he will go, or to what ludicrous depths of self-humiliation he will descend in his wild pursuit of humankind." This is the God that so many of us have put our hope in. And when you understand there are no lengths to which he will not go to save you and rescue me from our sin, there's so much hope in that. And if all the things in which you've placed your hope have left you down and have left you disappointed, I have good news for you. A Savior has been born. Someone who will take your sin, your pain, your grief, and your shortcoming, and your failure, your brokenness, and carry it on his shoulders. And he came into our world, and he became one of us, and he understands your grief, and he understands your sorrow, and he understands your circumstances. And then he took your sin upon himself, and he allowed himself to be put to death on a cross. His body was buried, and according to multiple eyewitness accounts, Jesus rose from the dead. Hundreds of people saw him alive, and here's what that means. That means death is defeated, and your sin is defeated. The things that have kept you bound and imprisoned, Jesus carried those with him to the grave and defeated them on your behalf. And now he invites us to simply find hope in him. That we trust him, that we find hope in him. You've been invited to do that. And if you've never said yes to that invitation, here's what I can tell you. You don't have to behave your way into it. You don't have to church attend your way into it. You don't have to just be a good person 51% of the time and tip the scales. It is an invitation that is extended to every person by the God who created you and loves you. And all you have to do is say, okay, I want to say yes to that invitation, and I'm going to put my hope, I'm going to find hope in the message and the good news of Jesus. Whether you're watching online, here in the room, if you want to say yes to that invitation, just agree with this prayer. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for those times that I've walked away from you. I've turned my back on you. And yet, what I'm discovering is that you continue to passionately pursue me. You never give up on me. And I'm so grateful for that. And so I want to say yes to your invitation. Make me your son, make me your daughter. And help me to put my trust in you. Help me to find hope in you. And to follow your way of living as best as I know how from this moment on. Thank you for coming into this world. Thank you that you understand what I'm going through. And you walk through it with me. I pray this in your name. Amen.